Hey there, welcome back to part 2 for this Mozrog Skragbad. I didn't want to do a 1 hour painting tutorial, it's a bit of a pain. But anyway, here we are with Mozrog himself, and we're going to start, as we do with all orcs, with the skin, because it's a big mess and it's always covered in little bits, and getting it back is a pain layer. So I've got some Warboss green here, and I'm giving a fairly generous coating, without being too gloopy about things, but we want to cover all of his skin in Warboss green. And we do some wet blending on his skin today instead of dry brushing. So all of his skin in Warboss green. Make sure we get all the bits and pieces. And I don't have to worry about all the details. I can be very, very careful with those later. But with the wet blending, I can make a little bit of a mess and still get the effect that I want. So once we've got the whole thing done in Warboss green, what I'm doing is I'm coming back with Orc flesh, and while everything's still wet, I'm just working it into the highlight areas that I want it to be in. So the top of his hair, top part of his muscle, but I'm keeping those darker undertones on the under part of the muscle and anywhere that's directly underneath the light, so underneath his chin, inside of his ear, underneath of his fist, the inside of his fist as well, because there won't be too much light in there. And then I'm coming back in with a little bit of Flashgit's yellow. So what I did first was I mixed a little bit of Flashgit's yellow with the Orc flesh, then I wet blend that in too. And I'm always just keeping working and always moving and into the areas that I want it to be highlighted, and just working gradually smaller areas until eventually what I'm doing is I'm actually just working with Flashgit's yellow on its own in just some of these tiny areas, working it around so we get a good texture to the skin, and when you really catch some nice highlights. And when this dries out, it just looks fantastic. Really good blend between the colours without being too smooth of a gradient, so it's got a little bit of textured interest. So you can see the highlights are really starting to come through. And getting those edges in his face, the tips of his ears, and the bridges of his eyebrows. Well, I do love wet blending, but I feel like if you do it too much, eventually it becomes tedious and doesn't really have the same effect. You want those differences in texture for the model, you know. Metal doesn't have the same feel as flesh, and by using different techniques we can help separate those parts. Now with that dry, I'm going to go in and I'm going to start with the deepest part first. So I'm going to be painting the actual harness that's around his wrist. I'm doing this in Steel Legion drab. Just making sure I don't miss anywhere, because coming back and fixing it will be hard as I'm building up on the details, getting to the higher areas with different colours. So I'm just making sure I get into everything that's going to be in this colour, all the leather parts that I think he uses to sort of protect his probably very delicate orc flesh from all that rough metal. Now on Mephiston Red, I'm just giving his eyes some tiny little dots, and the contrast between the red and the green itself is already setting us up with good contrast, but because we've got the darker Warboss green in there and we get that really bright Mephiston Red, the two really help that eye stand out from the rest of it. I'm using the same Mephiston Red onto some of this strapping onto his gauntlet. Again, good contrast and good coverage, so we're not having to be hyper careful in these fiddly little areas, so we can get a good effect without doing any harm to the bit that we want to get all this lovely detail in. Okay, now we're going to paint the entire weapon, and basically his entire right half, in dark aluminium, because obviously this metal weapon needs to be metallic, but also his big metal arm, his metal spine, the metal half of his face, all of it very carefully applying with a smaller brush, not forgetting to water down the paint so that we get a good control over where it flows to. because we don't want to spoil the skin that we painted. I do drop the models quite often. Surprised it doesn't have a worse effect on things. But it's not really dropped for that far. So all the metal on his claw. And as you can see, over on the other side, the entire arm, that spine, and the right side of his face. Make sure we get into all those bits and pieces, because with those, the shadows that we sprayed in earlier, in these metal parts, we don't want that contrast to come through. We don't want that colour effect, really. Except where it's darker and the underneath, we can keep those darker purple tones for the shadows, but we don't want the yellow to come through on the metal. So just being careful to get some good coverage here. And this bright colour from the brighter colour, struggling to get that one out, but the brighter colour there of the metallic paint will help us with some of the details that we're going to pick out on here. We'll do it in Retributor Gold, but also some of these little emblems that he has welded on the top. We're going to do those in colours, and we'll get more of a pop with that aluminium underneath it rather than those random shading colours. Now here we go. Like I say, I like to do the cogs in the Retributor Gold. All this will be tied together when we wash it in just a little bit. But just getting into some of those bits and pieces very carefully. I imagine his shoulder to be one big working cog, and then some of the little pistony looking parts, and some of the details on that claw as well. Retributor Gold. And this is like adding highlights to me. It's like, I want to add in these details, I want to bring it to life, but if I do too much, have I taken it too far? Is too much of this gold now? Would an orc have this much gold on him? So just carefully getting those bits and pieces done, and breaking up the colours, so we get a nice, interesting piece. Now with some Wraithbone, carefully picking out his teeth. We'll tie these in with the rest of the flesh with a wash in a second, once this is all dry, but being very careful because we don't want to ruin that skin that we worked so hard to wet blend. Getting all of his little choppers. Now, Berserker Bloodshade. I'm using this for the edges of his teeth, but I'm also using it for some of the shadows. So in the darker areas, or where the metal meets the meat, so to speak, I'm just dropping it in because it's had such a good effect on the Squigosaur. I did it here too. So I'm in there, into the edge of the teeth, but I'm also dropping into some of the shadows. So he's got a slightly meatier feel to him. And then if he has these little scars on his head, I'm just dropping it in there as well. I'm just using some Vallejo Black, I think this was. No, this is the contrast paint. So this is the Black Legion, and I'm doing some of this claw in black because I felt like it was just too much metal, and when I go to null oil it'll look too samey. So when I paint this black in, it gives it a nice sort of tempered effect, like it's been painted over for protection, and then the metals come through as it's been used to slay Space Marines. Mephiston Red now. I'm using that to pick out some of these little details, these little emblems on his arm. Again, this just helps break it up a little bit. Adds a bit of contrast. Hold your eye on that arm so you're forced to take in the details by the contrast that I've put in with the paint. being careful. This can be fairly easily fixed with a bit of dark aluminium, but again, we don't want to be fixing things we don't want to, because that really does take some of the fun out of painting, having to sit there tediously fix mistakes. It can really take the wind out your sails. Now, watered down, Nuln Oil all over the metal. All over the metal. And that's going to tie those parts together. Make those emblems look a little dirtier because they're not going to be brand new and clean. And everything just goes together nicely. And by keeping it watered down, we can control how dark it is a little easier, rather than just getting those horrible coffee stains. Or those tea stains, or whichever your beverage of choice stains. So we're washing all the metal, and it'll tie in nicely with the rest. So getting on the spine, the arm, and the claw on the other side. Always go a little heavier on the underneath as well, because I just feel like that's going to be a little bit darker. Now for the base. What I've got here is actually just a piece of bark that I found in my garden. And I cleaned it up a little bit and sanded it down by sort of running it backward and forward across a piece of sandpaper that I had on the table, so I had some nice flat edges, and just put a load of super glue onto it, glued it to the base, because it's way more interesting in the base than just having a plain base with a stone or a bit of sand. And I'm airbrushing the whole thing here in Doom Bull Brown. Nice bright brown. It's going to be a nice bit of contrast against that super dark shadow on the belly of the Squigosaur. So I'm just making sure I get all of the areas with the Doom Bull Brown. And I'm using the airbrush. You could use a dry brush to do this, or you can do this any other way you want, but this is Caliban Green, just into some darker, more grassy areas that are a bit less worn down, should we say. I'm not really going for any particular kind of surface here. I'm just trying to add colours that I think are interesting, and it comes out quite well. So what I've also done there is I've filled in some gaps with some milliput that I've sort of pushed in there, and then using a wet piece of cork, I've pressed it into the milliput to give it a texture. So you can see there's actually two Space Marine handles and a little knife. And by using that that wet piece of cork, we get that really nice natural feel to it, and then it doesn't stick out as a random piece of wood. Now I'm giving it all a dry brush. And that's just to pick out the details, and it ties together the green and the brown nicely by giving them both the same sort of highlight, but because we're dry brushing, the undercolours come through that highlight too, so we get this really nice sort of spectrum of colours without having to work too hard by mixing and blending lots and lots of different things. We're just quickly going over, so it gets a natural random feel, but also a really good variety. I'm just picking out the natural texture in the wood. Because we've used thinner layers of paint, we get loads and loads of texture. So there you go, that Skragbad dry brush, and now I'm literally just using Blood Angels Red, and then the highlights that we've got through the dry brushing will come through that contrast paint and do all the work for us. And because this isn't the focus of the model, we don't need to be super detailed here, we just need to give it a little bit of shape. And I'll go back in with some the Caliban Green and do the eyes, because I don't want them to be bright and glowing because they're not attached to a Space Marine anymore. We just want to make sure that the eyes look different from the helmet, so it's like a dark, unlit green lens. So we've got two Blood Angels helmets. And the reason I went with Blood Angels is because that red just sort of fits in nicely with the brown. And I think if we'd have had a Dark Angel or an Ultramarine, or especially an Imperial Fist, those bright colours would have held your eye on the base, and we don't want your eye down there, we want it up. So there with the sword slash knife, sheaths in black, and the handles in dark aluminium, a little bit of gold detail. And I know that means it's a Space Wolves knife, but who cares. So doing the edge in black before we get ready to glue them back together. And as you can see, I've got these little stumps of toothpicks sticking out that I've drilled into the base, and they match up with the holes on his feet. Loads of super glue in the holes because we want this to be stuck on, and I've put some grass tufts around the toothpicks, so the grass tufts will fill up any gaps between the feet and the base. There we see, it just clips in nicely, pressing down firmly without being too aggressive. And then those grass tufts mean that he doesn't look like he's just floating on thin air above the base. And then just one last thing I caught, some details with the Ushabti bone onto the skull on his back, and the little teeth that are hanging off there too. It's always good to take a last look and check you haven't missed anything. You are the too. And that's him, done. Some nice blue to green transition mood light, and then in slow motion all by himself. Really happy with how this one came out. Really enjoyed painting this model. I'd definitely paint another one. Maybe do him as a Squig boss. But there you go. Give us a like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.